between women and Latinos and blacks as disenfranchised and dominated populations, but rather just saying, well, you're different from them and you're different from them and you're different. And so there's no understanding of, well, but we're all subjects of or targets of or being penalized by a system that privileges a very small group of individuals, empowers a very small group of individuals at the expense of a larger population. You know, there are very interesting conversations that you have underway here in Israel, we have underway in the US and Europe, about just the dominance of a very, very small percentage of the population over the majority population. Dominance rooted in their control of economic resources. But there's always a push for us not to have these conversations. Rather, it's to scramble among ourselves for the little bit that's thrown out here. And each of us scramble to get our little piece of it. And the larger piece sits over here. The 85% sits over here, held controlled, say, by 10 or 15% of the population. And the 85% of the population then struggles and dances and fights over the 15% that is put out here. It's some lessons for us. I don't know quite all of how to process it and what to do with it, but I think it's important for us to start and continue to think about those questions. Yes, please.
No, if I may continue, just saying that I remember I was, because I think there is a difference between undergrads and grad students, like the environment is totally different, and I think it's more emotional environment, like psychological environment. And I think it gets to a point where, like, if you're an African American, I remember I was part of electrical engineering project that they really tried to retain minorities there, especially African Americans. And the problem is that even if you want to be a normal student, like if you're an African American, you just want to focus on learning and not to be active as in leadership or other groups, it's just impossible. You get so much pressure. And that story, you have that project there of excellence. I can't remember exactly what it is of electrical engineering. I don't know the name of but there is a project there of excellence, something like this, to retain African Americans in electrical engineering. And he told me, the director once, that he knows the story of two students, African Americans, who wanted just to study, and they couldn't. They had so much pressure to be involved in other activities, while the Asian students, and there are differences between Filipinos and Chinese, the Chinese students could have stayed in the library until midnight, yes, and not to be active, and the parents will take care of them, while the Africans had so much pressure to be active. And that was also another part of not being able to be normal, just to be a student. And
by the way, that takes us back to this issue that Rami raised of just having a critical mass. If there are only 2 of those African American students in the electrical engineering as opposed to 80 or 100, then you don't allow for the natural diversity of human personalities and choices, because those 2 have to be everything to everyone.
Yeah.
Whereas if there are 80 or 100, there are some who will be socially active. There are some who will just be the nerds who go in the library at the break of dawn and don't leave until midnight. But when you only have the 2 people, you don't have that option. And you remind me of something else too. We've undertaken the research of this contradiction of women who really outscore the males in terms of their GPAs, in terms of their test scores. And so on the surface of it, by those metrics, should be the ones who are overrepresented in the hard sciences. But they're leaving those hard sciences because they come into a classroom situation they say that's not conducive, that communicates to them that they're aliens, or that doesn't speak to them as women scholars. And so they then will move out of a physics program that they're making A's in into something that is not over on that side of campus. They'll move into sociology or they'll move into English because they have more of a critical mass and more representation and feel more comfortable and more accepted in that environment. So again, the lessons about the architecture of privilege and disadvantage on these campuses and how we must examine and change those dynamics, both in terms of faculty as well as in terms of students. Because, by the way, the patterns for students are reflected for faculty and vice versa. And sometimes the situations that students face are even worse and more extreme for faculty members because the stakes are so much higher. Yes, please.
from within the minority groups, trying to form their own identities and protect them. So from the majority group. I'm referring to Arab students. In my college, they are about 20% of the students, and I found that they are talking Arabic among themselves. They wouldn't let anyone talk to non-Arab students. They would always come as a group, walk away as a group, keep the group identity, and it happened also at the university. When I was in classes where there were only very few Arab students, they would try to assimilate. But when we had large classes with many Arab students, they would never try to assimilate, not even talk to us. They would always keep themselves in different groups, and they have social monitoring of interactions, unofficial interactions. As soon we would go on the corridors, and as soon as an Arab student spotted another Arab student talking to a Jew, he would start talking with him or her in Arabic and try to pull them out of the Jewish group. So there are very strong segregatory processes starting to be active as soon as you get large numbers. And you wonder, because of course it's legitimate for them to form their own groups if that's what they wish to do. But in the end, you have power struggles instead of assimilation.
And your comment stimulated some discussion, and I'd like for those who are here to join the conversation. Then I'll offer my thoughts about that. Yes, please.
I would like to stress this point exactly perhaps from U.S. Point of view. If I may, when I've been in U of R in Virginia, actually there were communities of color, and you would see breaks, for example, they put music, and so you see the Afro-Americans grouped together with their music, and you see white kids with their music, and you would see a complete. Well, I didn't see it, but
in the library. That's a stereotype.
But if I can, point on Principle 6 that you've been mentioning earlier about the faculty that should be involved. Well, it's very hard to engage in this kind of, try to unite or try to make some bridges between these communities, because you see in Richmond that the population looks at the university as kind of a bubble. It's not realistic. I mean, they see it as something which is not realistic, so the kids go back home, many of them very far from Virginia, and they don't have the atmosphere. So I don't see how in these terms I don't see how it could be realistic. And to make things even worse, I was thinking about what the former president of the Hebrew University, Megiddo, said. And he fought for being excellent, and he takes U.S. academia as an example. That Harvard, Princeton, NYU, they have this model that excellence is the only parameter. So really, all this talk about diversity is important, but it doesn't raise in these places, because the most important thing is that the kid is, have good achievement, very, very bright, and doesn't. So this is the right key to solve the problem. So this is just very, very general. I'm sorry.
Much appreciated. I have to say a couple of things very quickly. NYU, Stanford, and Harvard are our most diverse institutions in the country. And they focus on diversity explicitly. I mean, Harvard, for example, wants students from Montana. They want students from Florida. They want students. They could fill their class from students in Boston and New York City. But that's contrary to the whole model of excellent education. So they emphasize diversity. And in terms of black representation on Stanford's campus, it far outstrips representation at the public universities in the in California, at UCLA. So for whatever it's worth, that's something to think about. And I guess I'll try to put those two comments together. One of the challenges is to create environments where everyone feels that their culture is valued and where you feel like you have a voice. And when you don't feel like you have a voice, you will have a tendency to withdraw. Now, needless to say, young people are working out their identities and all kinds of things are happening. And sometimes you'll have just an overemphasis of an identity because kids become very, they're at that stage in life where they can be extreme. Now, one way I deal with this is that I create situations, this is back to Principle 6. In my class, you all go into the same boat. I go and randomly assign students to these working groups. And they must talk to each other because all of their grades are dependent on Group A and what happens in Group A. And so faculty can do something as simple as create a mechanism that facilitates interaction and conversation that requires it, but requires it around a specific project, not simply how do you feel about this and how do you feel about that, but really collaboration where you get to know the other group and you get to know the other individuals. So those are very real challenges. And the other thing that your comment reminds me of is a book that was written by Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's now president of Spelman College. Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? Right? Now the parallel or corollary to that question is, well, those kids are like 5% of the total student population, 10% of the total student population. Why are all the white kids sitting together in the cafeteria? Why is it the responsibility of those 5% of the black kids to dissipate themselves and diffuse themselves among this larger population? And just like a chemistry question, if you take a small drop and dissipate it among a large gallon of water, then you start losing some of the traits and characteristics of that large drop. And that has consequences for individuals, and sometimes they want to be apart, but at the same time they want to be who they are. And so that becomes the challenges for institutions as we think about how to create a situation where it's not one student to every 100, and that one student has to serve the needs of all of those 100 students for diversity. But in fact, if we have more of the underrepresented students in that situation, which tend to service the needs of the other 100 for a diversity experience, or it's 20, then the stress and strain on that one or on those few individuals is less problematic. But again, you're talking about the politics of Israel and a whole set of other issues that I am not so schooled on, but I do know, I remember those moments when I was an underrepresented black student during the political black movement on the predominantly, overwhelmingly white campus of Beloit College. It was 1,500 students, and there were 40 of us who were black students. And for that matter, at the University of North Carolina, where the faculty was 2,000, and again, interestingly enough, there were 40 of us who were black faculty. So something about this number of the 40 that is very striking. So there are lessons, and the key is for us to start having conversations with one another and have enough diversity in the room in those conversations so that we can hear from the one side that says that you're segregating yourselves, and then from the other side that says, well, you're pushing us away. You're saying for us to come in, we must strip away who we are and come in as if we're just any other white kid and not bring my music with me, or not bring my perspectives with me, or not bring my experiences with me. So the question is, how do we work through those issues? And we work through it by conversation, and we work through it by critical mass and by empowering the voices that are often lost in these conversations. Yes, please. Yes, please.
A side issue. I know that increasingly in American universities, especially in graduate schools, there are many foreign students and foreign faculty too. So and they come from all countries. They come from India, from China, from Israel,
exactly.
from other places. I wonder, how do you see their place in the student or faculty population, and are they between these groups, or do they compete with the minority groups, or if you have any insights?
I think that's a good point, a series of questions you raised. It's a little bit of all of those on some level. Ultimately, again, when you start talking about academic institutions, you talk about excellence. And you want in that excellence to attract the very best. And my idea is that you can't have academic excellence without having diversity. You honestly can't, because what you'll have is a very narrow definition. You would have only people who do regression in sociology. Not much of a sociology department. Or people who only study demography. And the world of the social questions is much broader than a demographic, quantitative scientist. So the key is that I would say you have to look at those questions in a broader lens. Now, for me, the lens, quite frankly, becomes one of just an international economy that moves labor forces around and moves those labor forces around and moves the capital around, not necessarily in ways that are about enhancing the individuals and enhancing the populations, but often it's just about maximizing the profit of a particular set of goals. But that's me, and I have to say, I have to be very careful. That's just simply my construction of, because when I think about the example you gave, I think about how labor moves and how capital moves around the world to not necessarily advantage certain groups of laborers, but often to play them against one another. You know, if you're asking for too much here, we'll take this over there. We'll take the job, we'll take the opportunities over here. So in thinking about the diversification of higher education faculties and students, it's the positives of bringing those different opportunities and experiences, but at the same time, it's a question of thinking about what are the forces and the goals that are operating there. And I know that's a mismatch of an answer, but honestly, for me, it's so complicated. Yes, please.
Can I add a little
Sure,
bit about
please.
that? Because I know a little bit internal information. Before I left UCLA, it was called University of Caucasians with Asians because
University
of Caucasians lost with Asians. As opposed to the 70s, it was used to call UCLA. But the thing is that because the UC system was in major financial crisis in California, is still in major financial crisis, so the international institute were looking, international program was looking for students who can afford coming to UCLA. I mean, in the past, a public university like UCLA would be like $15,000 per year, which is $5,000 used to be for residents.
Well, that was actually a past when you could go for free.
Oh, okay.
Literally, you could literally go for free.
And I can tell you that in 2009, when I left UCLA, it was $25,000. It was like $8,000, I think, for residents.
And yes, and now it's $28,013.
Okay, so it's like, actually, it's better to go to a private university where they can give you a grant. But they were looking for Indonesia and China and Japan because their parents could afford it.
In Saudi Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia because they could afford paying for their kids this kind of amount because they like UCLA, it's considered a top university. So they were looking for a representative from Africa and other places. But in fact, what happened, especially if you go to hard science, the majority are, it's not nice to say that, but are Asian from China and a little bit from Japan. But they've been struggling, because I know the international aspect of UCLA, and they've been struggling dramatically with this issue.
Yeah, but it's interesting because here you have students who, on the one hand, seem to be minorities. For the American white students, they are like minorities. They come from different countries. They seem to them like minority. On the other hand, there are people, like you said, from affluent families who can afford it. So countries or families?
Because some countries pay, like Brazilian government pays, and usually you get privileged students from Mexico or Brazil, not the peasants, if I may say so. So they pay them to come to UCLA. They pay them to come to the U.S. And eventually they will go back to Brazil or Mexico. I mean, I remember we had a student, you probably know Octavio, And we had so many conversations because his father is a politician, and he came in. First he thought, oh, I'm going back to Mexico, I'm going to make a religion. And little by little he decided to stay in the US and even justify why he stayed. And I love Octavio.
Octavio is in Utah now.
Really? It's so I cannot imagine that. And he's a great friend of mine, and I really love him. But we had many conversations about it. And so they come to the US, they get paid by the government, and eventually they don't even go back to make the change. Well, what happened at least in the 60s and 70s and 50s in Israel, the Israeli scholars would come back and invest in Israel. And this one thing that doesn't happen. And with the black people, I mean, I think also Patricia Collins really talks a lot about the tension within the black community as opposed to...
And whatever it's worth, to be fair to Octavio, how many of us go back to our communities when we're educated?
That's true. No, he's very inside the U.S. He works a lot with the Chicanos or Latinos.
But I'm just thinking about when you get this privilege, how many of us literally... You know, I grew up in slums in Kansas City, Missouri. I haven't gone back to those slums. I mean, it's just very honest. It's just honest for us to think.
But he came from a fluent family, and he was actually...
In Mexico.
And that's the thing, that he was talking, I'm not saying, I mean, he can stay, and I told him, you know, don't feel guilty that you're staying in the U.S. His wife had American passport, so that's how he became a citizen. But it was so interesting to see from the time he was a doctoral student and the changes in it, because he came from a fluent family. Carlos Torres was the best friend of his father, so he had privilege, and he said, okay, so I can invest in the Chicanos here in California. Now he said he's in Utah. So
but you know what's very interesting? I'd like to take that point and shift it to the Israeli situation, and to this whole issue of students struggling with being Arab in an environment that's largely Israeli. And how you can... Jewish. Excuse me. See, again, I show my ignorance, so thank you for the correction. That's largely Jewish. And then